Thank you so much for having me again. I appreciate the opportunity to come to you folks and talk to you about a gardening 101 today. I guess we get started. You want to share the screen, Gabriella? And then please feel free to put your questions in the chat if you have any questions as they're kind of coming to you. So, and then when the Q&A comes, I can refer to that. All right. So what do we want to talk about today? Whoops. Oh, we can go to the next one. Sorry. Okay. So we're going to talk, of course, about the many benefits of gardening. And I guess maybe it's one of the questions I have in the chat, since we have a pretty good sized group. How many of you are gardening right now? Or would you kind of give me your indication of what you think your kind of skill level is as far as gardening is concerned? I'd love to know where we're all at this point. So we're going to talk about the many benefits of gardening. Some basic gardening terms. There's a lot of like little words, lexicon around gardening that people like to throw around. So, oh, excellent, excellent. We're going to talk about building the soil. For me, that is probably one of the most important things in regards to gardening, is being able to build that healthy soil and all the benefits that come from that as well. We're going to talk about edible crops, as well as drought-tolerant plants and succulents. We're going to talk briefly about care and maintenance, and then I'm going to talk about pests. And then, of course, we'll have some opportunity at the end to answer any of your questions that you might have. All right, next slide. All right. Now, for those who are already gardening, I'm sure you could, you're free to add to this list, of course, but these are some general benefits of gardening. Mostly just the idea, for me personally, it's being able to grow your own food or herbs or medicines, or medicine as food. And for those who are already gardening, I'm sure you can completely be in with me on this. There's just something very valuable and something very wonderful about being able to go to your garden and harvest whatever's in season, that you know it's at the right time to pick it. It's perfectly right. The sugars are perfect, and you're taking them in to your house or giving them to friends. And there's really something to really be said about how that makes you feel as a person, to be honest. It's also great for creating areas for pollinators and beneficial insects. Those, especially if you're growing things like food, having pollinators and beneficial insects as part of your landscape is super important. That is a match that has to go together. Creating drought-tolerant landscapes in order to conserve water and resources is also another great idea. I know that Nicole had talked about the rebate for lawn conversion. I highly recommend it. And if check your water agencies. Depending on where you live, you might want to check your state or anything that's maybe on the county or the city level as well, and check and see if there's offer for lawn conversion rates. Again, building healthy soil for the benefit of plants and soil life is great. It's relaxing, very stress relief, kind of overall mental health. In all honesty, this past year, I have really heavily relied on my garden to really get me through some stressful times. Definitely, I've been teaching, I've been working, but this year's been trying for a lot of people, and being in the garden, expanding my garden during this time has been wonderful. It's just been really, really wonderful for me overall, plus the food that you end up getting, of course. There's lots of great good bacteria in the soil to help you kind of boost your immune system. They also say it kind of gives you kind of like a antidepressant effect. So being out there and putting your hands in the soil and just spending time outside is just really, especially when I know a lot of you were spending a lot of your time sitting in front of the computer, Zooming and doing stuff, having meetings and stuff. It's fun and can be so rewarding. But gardening's kind of like fishing. You can go out and have all the best laid plans, but you may not necessarily catch any fish. But gardening, I think the odds are a little bit better on gardening, but some years can be problematic. Some years can be bumper crops. So there are highs and lows, but that's really all part of gardening. You're not truly a gardener until you've actually killed a plant. If you have all great successes, that's great, but you're not officially a gardener until you've overwatered, underwatered, did whatever it takes to kill it. And it's a great opportunity to save money. For me personally, I think gardening kind of gets a bum rap about the idea that it has to be this huge, expensive ordeal. And then there are some kind of expensive elements to gardening. But I'm here to say that you can do it very on a good budget by implementing things that are free, implementing things that are associated with reuse, recycling, stuff like that. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about the lingo. I'm gonna show off some plants here real quick. The one on the left is the tree collard. They're going to be great anywhere you live. So if you're living in Tennessee, or you're living in Oregon, or you're living possibly even in another country, welcome, by the way. Tree collards are wonderful. They are a perennial collard green. So which means I'm going to plant it and it's going to last me probably, it's going to give me about 4 to 5 years worth of leaves. They grow pretty tall, sometimes up to 6 feet, depending on kind of where they're oriented. Super nutritious, and they handle a variety of different climates, cold as well as hot climates. I grew up them here in Martinez. We get to triple digits in the summertime, and they handle it pretty well. On the opposite end, I have another perennial. It's called the manzano pepper. It's a hot pepper. It's a little bit hotter than the jalapeno when you're talking about what they call the Scoville scale. But it is also a perennial. So it usually dies back and then comes back every year. The nice thing about the manzano pepper is it really does really well in colder temperatures. A traditional pepper like a jalapeno or something like that, it's going to require pretty hot days, 70, 80 degrees, in order to really get seeds germinated and to get them growing, get them thriving to produce peppers. But these manzanos, they thrive in shade and temperatures as low as maybe like 55, 60 degrees. Yes, J Bell, yes, by all means, if Gabrielle or Nicole like, the PowerPoint is totally available to be passed along with some handouts that I sent out as well. So please feel free. So the technical terms, perennial, like I said, you plant them once and they're going to give you love. So that's fruit trees and artichokes and tree collards and nut trees, any kind of thing that's going to produce a fruit or a vegetable or a nut. Annuals are more things that people are probably more familiar with. They're plant once and enjoy, usually either one and dones, or you can enjoy it for at least the season. So tomatoes, squashes, things like basil, those are generally annual plants. Cilantro, annual plants. One and dones. Next. So these are biennials. They survive. They're kind of in between perennial and annual. They have 2 growing seasons. The first season being just getting everything established, leaves and plants. And usually in the case of carrots, the actual carrot. And then by the second season, you get the fruit, and then it sets seed and dies. Oh, parsley on the left, one of my favorites. All right. Seed types. That's okay. I'm sorry. You can go, Gabrielle. You're cool. There's 3 kind of specific seed types that I like to talk to you about. There's the hybrid seeds. And if you ever look at a seed packet, you'll see usually it'll have some sort of indication like a F1 or F2. Generally, those things are tightly controlled. Either they are done under scientific conditions or they're done kind of in a lab. But the thing about hybrids is you can't, if you want to save seeds, which I'm a huge fan of, there's no guarantee that the seed that you save is going to be the exact plant that you're going to have the following season when you go to plant it. It's not considered what we call a true seed. And I would like to make a distinction between the manipulation of seeds for hybridization versus the natural hybridization, excuse me, of plants. And I always like to use the squash example. So say Nicole and I, we live next door to each other. And this year I'm going to do zucchinis. And this year she's going to do pumpkins. So I get zucchinis, she gets pumpkins. And then we both save the seeds from our individual plants. Now, the next spring, we both plant the seeds from last year. And maybe I'll get zucchini and maybe she'll get pumpkin. Or I'll get pumpkin and she'll get zucchini, or we'll get a combination, a hybrid combination of both plants or any other kind of squash plants that happen to be living with kind of within our zone. So sometimes hybridization kind of happens naturally. So don't be worried if you go to plant something and it comes out to be completely different. As long as it's still edible, I say definitely go for it. So the next type of seed types, there is a pumpkini, yeah, something like that. A zumpkin. That was good, sorry. Open pollinated. Open pollinated is plants whose pollination is kind of natural and random. It's kind of lends itself to that zucchini story that I just told, where it's either bees or sometimes it's done manually, with Q-tips or with wind or with paintbrushes. But the nice thing about it is with an open pollinated or a wind pollinated seeds, you can save those seeds and then you're going to get the exact same thing as you planted next year. It's what's called a true seed. And generally open pollinated seeds are usually kind of like newer type of seed types, which is a little bit different than our last seed type, which is the heirloom. Now, generally heirloom seeds originate from maybe like 50, 60 years ago. And then those seed varieties have been passed down. And you saw those kind of coming into play a few years ago where you start seeing things in different colors, cauliflower came purple and red carrots. And a lot of those are heirloom varieties that are kind of brought back from the past. And those are great. Those also will provide you with the true seed. So every year that you plant it, you're going to get the same type of thing. Next. All right. Native plant. Now, depending on where you are, because we're not all here from California. So these are just plants that have existed since before the people showed up. So usually they're generally suited to your climate and whatever type of soil you have. My favorite example is yarrow. It is a California native. It's beautiful, drought tolerant, attracts a lot of beneficial insects as well as pollinators. So if you're looking for a really good, just catch-all kind of plant, yarrow is your plant, especially if you have like a small garden. I'd like to be able to incorporate a lot of native plants in my garden, but my garden is relatively small. But yarrow in a nice little pot fits the bill.
It's medicinal.
So drought tolerant. These are plants that can exist without water after getting established, generally about 1 to 2 or sometimes a little bit more depending on the plant. The more fleshier ones, kind of like this lavender, will get adjusted a little bit quicker. Usually things that have a big trunk or a lot thicker woody stems usually take maybe about 2 to 3 years to get established. And the nice thing about it is once they become established, you can turn the irrigation off, and then you have the option of just maybe supplementing them in the summertime. Some of them do go dormant to kind of save resources. So it's always good to check and make sure your plant is actually dead before you rip it out. Because I've heard some really bad stories about beautiful plants that were just laying, just taking a nap for the winter and got thrown away, which I'm very unfortunate. Some other great examples of drought tolerant plants. We have some succulents. There is aeonium in the top corner. I think that's cressula in the bottom. Buckeye, the bright pink one, that's California native. Our state flower, which is the California poppy. And of course, a lot of these plants will work definitely with other places as well. Just check and see, check with your native plant society in your area or for your state. I'm sure a lot of these plants will do a fair amount of crossover, but it's important to try to stick to native plants. And if you live kind of what we call in a Mediterranean climate, where you have hot summers, dry summers, and wet winters, then these are the type of plants that you can grow in that climate. And then feel free to take advantage of plants that exist in other Mediterranean climates. So things like pomegranates, which are from the Mediterranean, are plants in the middle. That's from South Africa. Plants from the western edges of Australia, South America, and Africa as well. Next. All right. Excuse me. Your hardiness zone. So basically it's the average low temperatures that your plants are going to thrive in. So it goes from 2 to 10. The San Francisco Bay Area is zone 10. My zone is 9B, and all you really have to do is just Google what's my hardiness zone for whatever your zip code is, 94553, that's mine. And it'll tell you what your coldest range is. San Francisco Bay Area, we don't usually get a lot of frosts. So as you can see, our shortest average is like 30 degrees. That's usually the coldest it usually ever gets. And then 30 to 40. So it's always kind of good to kind of figure out what that zone is, definitely, because sometimes it'll tell you on a plant, sometimes it'll tell you on a seed packet where it's gonna do well. Some plants need, especially things like citrus trees, they need good chill hours. So you'll need to kind of find out what your hardiness zone is to plant the appropriate type of plant for that. Then we have things like cover crops. Usually they're also known as green manures. They're generally plants grown to either improve the soil or to fix nitrogen or bring nitrogen to the soil. Generally any kind of legume plant like the vetch or the fava, they're there to actually pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil where it'll still be held by these little nodules that are attached to the roots of the plant. Other plants like the rye or the oats, their big thing is their roots are fibrous and they go deep into the soil and they help break up soil. So especially if you're dealing with clay soil, this will be a great one as well. There's another one that's not there. There's buckwheat. That's another, which is different than the bright pink one that I showed you. This buckwheat is a cover crop. This one, sometimes the roots can go down as far as 6 feet. So if you're trying to, and it's a great way because you just plant them by seed. So it's just a great way to kind of improve the quality of your soil by not really having to do a lot of work other than just plant seeds. Next. All right. So let's talk about gardening terms in terms of the ratio that you usually see on things like soil amendments and stuff like that, which is NPK. As you can see, my example of my fish fertilizer, which is the NPK of 5:1:1. So nitrogen is our first number. It's for stem and kind of leaf development. Oh, that's a typo. And leaf development. So I kind of liken that to kind of like the skeleton of our plant. So branches, leaves, stems, all rely on a lot of nitrogen. So if anyone's growing anything right now, a lot of our fall and winter crops is really about, it really relies on nitrogen. So things like cilantro or spinach or cauliflower or greens, you're definitely they're going to rely solely on nitrogen. And so you're going to want to make sure that they get a fair amount of nitrogen in order to kind of keep that nutrition flowing. The second number is our phosphorus number. It is responsible for kind of like flower and fruit development for sure. If you've ever grown anything and the skeleton was great, you got beautiful leaves, it got really tall, but when it came to it actually producing flowers, maybe it never produced flowers, or maybe it produced flowers and the flowers fell off, or it produced flowers, started to produce fruit, and then that fruit fell off. So usually that's a general understanding that's phosphorus. And I usually like to give phosphorus to my flowering, fruiting plants around the time that they start to flower and fruit. Again, plants are kind of like in that stage are like hungry teenagers, and they require a fair amount of nutrition to keep them going. And phosphorus, which also, even though like in this example of the fish fertilizer, it's higher in nitrogen, it's more nitrogen dependent. It does have a little phosphorus, and then still a fair amount of phosphorus stuff is still going to have some nitrogen. So, but it's going to be more phosphorus dominant for the most part. So for flower and fruit development, but still supporting your skeleton with the nitrogen. And the potassium, you usually find that in either very small numbers, except for stuff like kelp meal. That's just for general health and metabolism of the plant. It's a great little addition to it. But these are like the three major building blocks of plant nutrition. Next. All right. So let's talk about building soil. It's a great foundation for every successful garden. It helps control things like pests, fluctuating temperatures from between moisture or hot and cold. My big example here is what's known as sheet mulching. I am converting a lawn here in San Leandro using cardboard as a weed blocker. Cardboard being way more permeable than, say, landscape fabric or landscape cloth. Unfortunately, those cloths don't allow for the permeability that cardboard does, and I've seen a lot of really great soil on top of landscape fabric, but never allowing any of that nutrition or even water to permeate down in through it to get to the soil where it really needs to get in order to lighten it up if you have clay soils to allow for increased drainage. Or I have sandy soil, so it's going to clump my sandy particles together to hold on to water and to hold on to nutrition a lot longer. So I'm using cardboard as a weed blocker, and I don't remove the tape because number one, I don't want to degrade the cardboard. I need the cardboard to be nice and solid. Also, the tape always ends up being more of a flag at the end. So if I've done a sheet mulch job, or I'm doing sheet mulching at my house and I see the tape, then I know that the cardboard is degraded and also the mulch is degraded, and it's time to replace both. And I usually just go back in with a patch of dry cardboard and put some brand new mulch on top. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about compost. It's completely decomposed materials, usually something that you're trying to add to. We're basically trying to mimic natural things that happen out in the forest, for sure. The example on top is kind of what we call like a basic compost. It's usually a combination of food scraps or herbivore manures, or like leaves and wood fibers. And that's going to build a nice little soil amendment for you. Something that you can mix in pretty good quantities with potting soil, about maybe 2 parts compost to, maybe 3 parts, 4 parts soil. The one on the bottom is actually worm castings, still compost, but that's done in a controlled situation called a worm bin. And that finished product ends up being more like a fertilizer. So you have to use that kind of sparingly. They're called castings, which is another kind of fancy word for poop. And but it's very high in nitrogen, and you can use that to fertilize your plants in your garden. And I use that often. That's usually my number one go-to for fertilization. So by using compost, you're going to be returning these nutrients into the soil, or even, especially if you are actually composting on site, you're basically kind of closing that loop. You're bringing in stuff into the, onto your property, and then you're using it, whether it be wood or food or anything like that. And then you're taking it and then you're just cycling it through, which is nice. Compost is great for holding onto water a lot longer in the soil, which is going to save you a little bit of money. Again, it's going to kind of balance out the moisture level and the temperature level in the soil. If it's nice and an even keel, Plants really love that. When they have to go through periods of hot and cold and wet and dry, that's generally when they kind of have a tendency to stress out. And you definitely don't want to stress that plant. A stressed out plant's going to attract a lot of pests to your yard for sure. Basic compost kind of is, we call that the great leveler. So it's the NPK for basic compost is 1 to 1 to 1. So it's totally equal. It's kind of the great levelizer. So I usually like to add compost for new bed plantings, just 1 to 2 inches right on top. And I'll, you know, as I water, it's going to work its way down into the soil as well. And then of course, it's easy to make. I have both a worm bin and a basic compost bin, and I love them both equally. Next slide. Mulch. We have 2 different types. We have a coarse mulch, which is usually kind of like chipped up wood. The example I have on the top on the right is my redwood mulch, which is kind of the Cadillac of mulches, at least here in California. Redwood exists in very wet conditions and works through that. So it takes a long time for redwood to break down, but you can't always get it. I got lucky that day. So you can use anywhere from about 2 to 3 to about 12 inches for sure. And in the case of the sheet mulching, I would put that on top of, I would do compost on top of the cardboard about 1 to 2 inches. And then I'd put about 3 or 4 inches of mulch or more, depending on what I'm trying to kill underneath it on top of that. That'd be great. And then there's a fine mulch that I probably only use maybe about 1 to 2 inches of it. Things like pine needle straw. Fine mulch is great for like annual beds because coarse mulch does have great water holding capabilities, but it might be too much for kind of like the tender leaves or the tender stems of annuals. Coarse mulch is great for things like perennials. So if you're doing like native plants or fruit trees, incorporating mulch around them is going to be wonderful. It's going to help with weed suppression because sometimes you don't want to deal with weeds having to compete with your plants. Water retention. And then of course, if you're trying to do anything on a slope, it's great for erosion control to make sure the soil stays in place. Next. All right. So other types of amendments that I like to use. So bone meal, I talk about that briefly, high in phosphorus, especially during the flowering fruiting periods for sure. You saw fish meal is another one. It's a granular. Bone meal and fish meal are both granular soil amendments. Just be mindful when you use them. Try not to use them on a windy day. Sometimes I like to mix them with some basic compost because they're very fluffy and kind of airy. And since I'm just mostly just putting them on top, if I mix it with compost, the compost kind of weighs it down or just kind of scrunch it into the soil and then water it in to make sure. Generally, also too, when I do soil amendments, I will water my plants first, and then just slightly, then I'll add my amendments, and then I will water in after to water them in. They just seem to take it a lot easier when the soil is a little bit more forgiving and able to allow for them to kind of pass down. All right. Another one of my favorites is coffee grounds. I got that in the top there. Used coffee grounds are a great way not only to add nitrogen to your garden, but they actually have a little bit of acidity left over after you've brewed coffee from them. And acidity is a great little option for edible plants. Especially things like citrus or blueberries, avocados, but it's really great for any kind of edible plant. Increasing the acidity in your soil slightly is going to be beneficial to help the plant take up nutrition. So, and again, it's probably something you may already have at your house that you're using. And then generally I'll just dry them out and spread them on kind of thinly. Coffee grounds do have a tendency to kind of get moldy relatively quickly. So it's kind of like thin to win. I usually tell people, like, if I'm putting like mayonnaise on a piece of bread and I'm in this analogy, the coffee grounds or mayonnaise, I still want to see the bread underneath. I don't want it to be, you can use them pretty regularly, but kind of thin to win is going to be your best option as well. Ground eggshells, which really never break down, but when you water them, they do leach their calcium into the soil. Ground finely and placed around existing plants acts as also as a barrier for snails and slugs that they won't want to cross. And then as you water them, they're again going to be adding calcium into the soil, which is great for the rigidity of annual plants. Nice. Epsom salts are also, I only use Epsom salts for things like peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, stuff like that. Generally, the nightshade family plants, they're called, have a problem with like a magnesium deficiency. So once a season, everyone gets about a tablespoon of Epsom salts, and they're good to go for the rest of the rest of their growing cycle. And then banana peels. Again, some of these things you may already have in your cupboard or in your kitchen, and it's a great way to kind of reuse a lot of materials that already exist, something that you already don't have to go out and buy. And again, a lot of these materials generally aren't really toxic as well. The example I have on the bottom is diluted worm castings. Again, they're kind of like they're definitely a fertilizer, so I'm going to want to use them a little bit more sparingly. So diluting them to the color of weak tea is especially important. That's going to ensure that you don't overuse anything. Next, please. All right. So now that soil's ready, let's put in some plants. And so the question I always I get asked is, what can I plant? And generally, you can go to the next slide. The answer I always give them is, well, what do you like? What's going to be the function of your garden? Are you trying to grow food for food as medicine? Are you trying to do like a pollinator garden, a cutting garden? You want something like super low maintenance that you can just kind of go out and chill in the evenings, do some light work for them? Are you trying to block your neighbors or trying to increase your privacy, create an outdoor room? So I always ask what the function is, and we can move from there. This is my garden. Actually, this is an older picture. This is my garden from last spring. It's moved a lot further forward to us since during the pandemic, for sure. Next. Some edible crops. Again, another great example of those tree collards I was telling you about. This one's probably about 4 or 5 feet off the ground from that picture. And then some blossoms from one of my lime trees. Next. All right. So these are a great opportunity when to plant annuals by season. So the cool season, and I think this is of course dependent on if you live a place where there is snow. Of course, your growing season is going to be a little bit shorter, but if you do live in the South or you live in more of a Mediterranean climate that doesn't have any snow, this is going to be kind of your better option. So right now we're kind of in the cool season. So, and we're kind of in that weird transition season for California, where it's still cold enough to grow all the things for the cool season crops, but we're already kind of thinking towards spring because we're all going to be planting things like tomatoes and cucumbers in the next couple of months. So these are just some great examples about different things to grow. And then as you can see, as you get hotter and hotter, the different types of plants, when you get down to things like sweet potatoes and peppers, they need really long hours of daylight. Now, I want to just put a little asterisk after this whole thing, because depending on what your yard is or what your garden is or where you're going to be planting, your garden is going to have different little zones or little microclimates. You're going to have maybe some shady areas or some full sun areas. Maybe your yard is surrounded by a fence, or it's my backyard's all paved over and long and narrow. So I get an increase in temperature in my backyard, probably about anywhere from about 10 to 15 degrees in the summertime, just for the fact that my yard heats up relatively quickly and holds that heat. So for some of these things, especially things like tomatoes, maybe you don't, have, I'm sorry, on the opposite end of that, maybe you have some cooler areas that you want to be able to try to grow like cool weather crops all year long, or maybe you don't have as many sunlight options during the daytime, but you should definitely take heat into consideration. Heat's going to help germinate the seeds and also maintain a little bit more of a higher temperature, because as your day cools off, all that heat is going to be released by, say, your fence or your house or any kind of hardscape that you may have. And then your plant is, even though the sun will be going down at that time, your plant will still be able to take advantage of that. So it's kind of extends the day slightly. So I always tell everybody to try to experiment whenever possible, because you think it may not work, but I would say definitely give it a try for sure. Next, please. This leads right to that. Leafy veggies need 3 to 4 hours. All depends, 2 to 3, maybe if it's shady but still kind of warm, like especially even in the summertime, you probably need a little bit less of the sunshine requirements. And again, like I said earlier, most things take 6, but again, if maybe you only have 4, but you have a really hot yard, that 6 won't really matter because you'll have that heat as kind of a backup. Next. All right, seeds or starts. They're definitely cheaper than plants, for sure. I can get a pack of seeds anywhere from maybe about $3 to $5, depending on what variety or what seed company I've gotten them from. And I have an option of 100 seeds, which means even if I take a quarter of that off, I still have the potential for 75 plants. So it's definitely cheaper. So many to choose from. I can go to a nursery and look at tomato plants, and maybe they'll have 10 or 15, but I can look at a seed catalog and they're going to offer me probably at least 40 different types of different tomatoes. And then find a variety suited to your climate. So again, kind of like the Manzano, I've seen tomatoes that are kind of bred for cooler climates. They're going to ripen at maybe 55 or 60 degrees as opposed to that 75, 80 degrees that they would generally need. Diseases and pests are not imported, and I always recommend that that if you do go buy plants, just take a look at them, look underneath their leaves, and look for any potential pests. If you get 6 packs, look underneath there and look for things like slugs and snails, because if you just come home and you put them down, then you may have already started to incorporate snails and slugs into your yard. It's fun. And then the also nice things about it is they can be free, either free in terms of you've saved seeds and now you're using them again from last year, or you're trading with friends, or you've gone to a seed swap, or you take an opportunity to go to your local library and go to their seed library as well. On the opposite end, starts are great. They're easy access. You just go out and buy them. Generally with seeds, you're going to have to start them at least 8 to 10 weeks prior to putting them outside. Sometimes you may not have time for that. Sometimes you start the seeds and sometimes they die. So starts are always really easily accessible. They're ready to plant whenever you're ready to plant them. And I generally like to go to local nurseries, usually in my area, because they're going to have the plants that are suited to kind of our general area. And then I know that tomatoes are ready when I see tomatoes at my local nursery, and I know that the temperature is the right time to go ahead and put them out. And then definitely for perennials, a lot of gardening groups and people are starting to try like lemon trees from seeds, which is totally fine. I think that's a super fun experiment. But if I'm trying to get some lemons, I want to go ahead and get a plant. Next, please. All right. This one's kind of lengthy. Can we unshare screen really quick, Gabriella? I wanted to show off a couple of options for starting seeds. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of reuse. So for me, I really like to do it. So, that's dusty though. Cardboard egg cartons are a great option for starting seeds. Amend some soil, usually potting soil. Sometimes people like to do seed start mixes, whatever it works for you. I'm going to put that in there, and then I'm going to spritz it with some water, and then I'm going to put it in my makeshift greenhouse. This used to be fresh salad herbs. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to place it, I'm going to put the lid on it, and I'm going to put it somewhere warm and possibly sunny, if at all possible. I'd like to have both of these. And then when my first leaves start to emerge, I'm going to go ahead and pull this off, and then I'm going to just maintain them the rest of the time until such time it's time for them to be transplanted. Generally speaking, that depends on the climate outside, as well as when seeds first start, you get those two tiny little leaves that come out. And they're there specifically, of course, to kind of get photosynthesis started. But you actually have to wait for the next set that are much bigger. They're called true leaves in order to emerge. Those are super important because those are when you see the true leaves and they start to mature, then you know your plant will be ready to be placed outside. So cardboard, egg cartons, all different types of materials that you could use to create greenhouses. If I'm doing like a multitude of plants or plants that are easily divided, I'm gonna take a 2-liter bottle. I'm gonna cut off the bottom. I'm gonna take a small container. Not this one though, this just happened to be in the box. Drill some holes on the bottom. I'm gonna fill it with soil. I'm gonna put like 5 or 6 different tomato seeds in here. Place this in here, place it on the top, and then allow them all to mature and grow all together. And then when the time comes, I can divide them evenly and then plant them out into my garden. Toilet paper rolls. And the nice thing about it, if you utilize anything like cardboard in order to do this, when the time comes to transplant, all you have to do is put it into the ground. You don't have to remove it from it because it's already gonna be nice and moist. The roots will just work their way down through the cardboard. All right, can we share screen again? Thank you. Make sure that gets. We'll see. All right. A lot of seeds can be directly sown in the soil. Like usually for spring and summer, I will do seeds for things like peppers or tomatoes, anything that's going to kind of produce a fruit. But if it's kind of just a plant like basil or cilantro, I'll just do by seed. I'll do squash just by seed. But other than things can be transplanted outdoors, if I'm doing something right now, basically any kind of kale or chard, I'll just do from seeds because they don't require a very high temperature for them to germinate. So I did some arugula by seed, some cilantro by seed. So yeah, so definitely there's a lot of things that you can do. If you do plant something and it doesn't germinate, don't totally give up because the soil may not have been the right temperature. Last year I planted chamomile, or I thought I planted chamomile, and it never germinated. So I went out and bought a plant. As soon as I went out and bought a plant, all the chamomile seeds that I planted germinated. So I had quite the bumper crop of chamomile last year. It was great. I talked about spring and summer crops kind of need about 6 to 8 weeks in order to be grown first and then to be transplanted. And then I talked about ways to getting seeds. Oh, thank you. All right. And I talked about all the rest. Next slide. Calendula on the left, snap peas on the right. This is the variety I tried this year. They are pretty good generally, snap peas, usually like colder climates, but these ones can actually tolerate a little bit more of a higher temperature, somewhere in the low 70s, which is nice. Next. All right, when to plant perennials. Fall is a great time. Well, fall is a great time to put any kind of things in. So you could take advantage of any kind of winter rains that you may have. So native and drought tolerance. Fruit trees, fall and late winter. Also, be mindful around this time of the year. Of course, again, depending on where you are, there is bare root fruit tree season. So a lot of our stone fruits, things like figs, apricots, pluots, nectarines, a lot of them come as bare root, which basically just means you have a small tree, and then the roots are kind of in a small bag. And the nice thing about it is because when you buy them, They're generally a lot cheaper than they would be if you bought them, say, 6 months from 6 months from December, from June or something. It's going to be at least twice the amount of money. Succulents you can plant anytime. Herbs you can plant anytime. Perennial herbs, things like oregano or rosemary or tarragon, stuff like that. Next. All right. Watering and irrigation. I love to water in the morning or in the evenings. Mornings, mostly because I like to check out, let's see what's going on in my garden. Usually you can catch things like slugs and snails on their way out in the morning, as well as just it's a great way to start the day. I'm personally a big hand waterer. I don't have any irrigation. My garden is all in containers, and I prefer to water by hand. I like it because, again, I can see if there's any pests. I can see if there's anything that I need to harvest. And it's just really, really time well spent, kind of spending time in your garden. They're great for flowers and for bees and for food and everything. But I think it's also important for us to kind of take our gardens into consideration, that they're pretty much an extension on your house. And so treat it like another type of room and spend actual time in it. Sit there, drink your coffee, have a glass of wine at the end of the day or the middle of the day, depending on what you're trying to do. So drip irrigation is also a great option as well. All right. Thank you, everyone. So water the soil. Try not to water the leaves if at all possible. If you do water the leaves, I usually kind of give them a good little shake. Sometimes I will water the leaves specifically. We have a lot of fires here in California, and so a lot of them, they get a lot of soot on their plants. So when that happens, you definitely should hose them off, because of course a lot of our plants, they definitely breathe through their leaves. So it's super important not to kind of choke that out, or if it's, if it gets dusty or dirty, depending on where you are, you always want to kind of keep that open. But I'm going to shake them off, of course, because something what happens is once the sun comes out, each little tiny droplet kind of magnifies whatever sun. And so you ever have a plant where maybe you have like these little tiny burn marks, and you're not really sure what they are or where they've come from. Generally, that's usually what happens in that circumstance. For drip irrigation, you can do drip irrigation for containers, or if you are doing things in ground, and there's a host of different options as far as drip irrigation is concerned. It's going to really maximize the amount of water that's used. If you're going to be using mulch, definitely put the emitters or even the tubing underneath your mulch. It's going to help protect it from the sun, so it's not going to degrade it over time. And then, of course, then it's going to trap that moisture between the mulch and the soil where it really belongs, and you're going to kind of reduce the amount of evaporation that happens. And then you could test the soil before watering. I got a soil probe, a watering probe a couple of years ago. I really like it. So I just go around to all my containers, test them out, and then I know who needs to get watered today, who maybe needs to get watered tomorrow. And some great recommendations for watering 2 or 3 times a week for annuals, especially if they're in containers. They do dry out quickly. That's the thing about container gardening, is they can dry out a little bit quickly, as well as they do need to be fed a little bit more often than in-ground gardens can. Perennials. With perennials, you're looking for longer amount of watering, but intermittent watering. So you're not going to water every day, maybe once or twice a week. You want to give it a really good soak, with the idea being that you really want to force the roots down into the soil, especially if you are working against a really, really hot summer that's coming up. Trying to get them established, trying to force the roots down into the soil. It's going to be super important in order to kind of help get your plant through hot periods, especially when the summer gets here. And then succulents are super easy. I really don't even irrigate them, to be honest. I usually plant them in conjunction with other plants that I might have that require water. So when I water them, they take advantage of whatever it is. They just need to kind of look plump and juicy is really what we're looking for. Next, please. This is called an olala. It is a subsurface watering. It's kind of old school. It's terracotta. That's, of course, which is super porous. You bury it under the ground up to the neck. You're going to water the soil around you, and then you're going to fill that guy up with water and put the lid on top. With the idea being, as the soil starts to dry out, it'll start to pull water from the olala, which is nice. Generally speaking, this type of olala you see, it's kind of expensive, but I have a great friend. She does the same thing, but she uses terracotta pots, which are way cheaper. She just caps the end, usually with some sort of crockery or something. She glues it on the bottom, and then she just puts a plate on top. And then she does the exact same thing. Water the soil, put it in there, and then fill it with water. For containers, I liked in summertime, I like to put saucers underneath. I'm gone a lot of the times. And so when I water it in the morning, sometimes the water, if it's too much water, the water will collect in the bottom. I'd rather have it collect in the bottom than run out, and then it's going to soak up the water later on during the day. In the winter time, I do the opposite actually with my containers. I remove them. I don't want them, and I actually raise, especially the perennials, up on blocks in order to kind of make sure that the bottom of my pot doesn't create some sort of suction with either grass or mud or even the cement, or sometimes algae or moss grows underneath it. Plugging up the hole is going to completely do, there's going to be no drainage, and then you could potentially kill your plant. We definitely don't want that. Plants are kind of pricey. Next, please. All right. Care and maintenance. I talked briefly about maintaining soil fertility. So add those amendments through the growing season, especially your containers. Pest problems, take care of them quickly. Prevention is always going to be the key, but however, pests are kind of a natural process as far as gardening is concerned. If you don't have any pests, then you'll have nothing for any of your beneficial insects to eat. You definitely want to try to incorporate beneficial insects into your landscape for sure. Clean those tools. They've been working with diseased plants. Things like alcohol work really well. Usually sometimes with metal tools, I'll just pass them through through my stove, my gas stove. Deadheading is important for plants. Especially if you want your plant to continue to produce more flowers, by cutting off the spent blooms. It's important, but I do understand that a lot of people like to save some of those things, because once they become kind of dead, then there's the opportunity for them to set seed. And by letting them set seed, you can reseed in that area or in another area. It provides food and habitat for things like birds as well, especially depending on when it goes to seed. If it goes to seed kind of in the late fall, early winter, it can provide some beneficial food for some of your native animals for certain. Make sure if you have fallen fruit, you kind of pick that up relatively quickly. You definitely want to try to avoid attracting any pests. And then just making sure that you prune some of your perennial plants, especially things like fruit trees, especially if they're deciduous. If the leaves all fall off, that's a great time to kind of do some judicious pruning in the fall and winter months. And what I mean by pruning, you're looking for dead or diseased or damaged branches. You kind of want the form of especially like a fruit tree, you want it to be kind of open in the middle. So you're going to want to cut off things that are crisscrossy, and just kind of make sure that there's enough wind flow that goes between. Plants that are too close together, that's where diseases kind of start to form. I've seen some really gnarly examples of really bad aphid infestations where there's like honeydew dripping from the tree onto the ground. It was horrible. But next slide. All right, so let's talk about pests. I got 3 examples. Whitefly, well, obviously that's pretty obvious. The one on the right is the tomato hornworm, and of course snails, and I throw slugs in that camp as well. Next. So prevention is key. Keeping that soil healthy, of course. Like I said, I can't stop talking about it. keeping moisture levels in the soil even, and then incorporating plants that are going to attract beneficial insects. Again, this is my yarrow that I love. If you look at the picture, you'll see what looks like a weird creature. That's actually the juvenile of the lady beetle. That's what they look like before they become that more traditional, red with the black spots kind of beetle. So you want to always try to make sure you kind of familiarize yourself with the life cycle of beneficial insects, because they look nothing like the juveniles look nothing like their adult counterparts. But the juveniles are the ones who eat the most, definitely eat the most. You really want to make it a very nice place for them to want to kind of hang out. I included yarrow, but sweet alyssum is also another great option. You can just get a pack of seeds for that, plant it once, and you'll never want for alyssum ever again. You'll have it forever. Again, it's kind of like this multi-flowered kind of situation that the beneficial insects really do like, and pollinators. Next. All right, the hornworm. 1 to 2 can decimate a plant for sure. Hand picking is pretty much your only option. Sometimes crop rotation can help. However, depending on how small your garden is, sometimes the area where there's the most sun, you have to plant your tomatoes there year after year after year. Generally, the hornworm makes a beautiful moth, gorgeous moth. And then it lays its eggs at the base of your tomato plants. And so if you plant the following year, then the hornworm is born with its favorite food. And I understand that you may not have any other options to go with the sunlight. So just kind of be mindful if you get tomato hornworm one year, just be mindful that it might come year after year. And hand picking is going to be the best. You can go out at night and take your flashlight. All those white stripes kind of, stand out in relief, and then you can pick them. That'll be a lot easier than try to find them during the daytime, because they do a really good job of camouflaging. But look at the lower leaves of your tomato plants. You'll see their poop. It kind of looks like broken up little pieces of like brownie bites. Like brownie crumbs. I hate to use a food analogy with this, but it kind of does look like that. And apparently they're very tasty, the tomato hornworm. There's a lot of recipes I saw last summer, about ways to cook tomato hornworms. Apparently they taste like fried green tomatoes. I'm gonna have to take everyone's word on that. Next slide. Slugs and snails, they come out at night and early in the morning to decimate your plants. So for them, it's really about barrier methods. I talked about crushed eggshells. I like to make cloches out of those 2-liter bottles, the same 2-liter bottle I like to use to use as a greenhouse. Cut the bottom off. You're going to want to cover the top with something meshy like cheesecloth, or if people still wear nylons, an old nylon, something like that, just so it can allow for gas exchange, but not allow slugs and snails to come in. And then I'll cover my plants at night, and they'll be protected not only from slugs and snails, but any kind of potential cold snaps, especially in those transition times in spring and summer, when sometimes the weather just goes cattywampus. And then another option is diatomaceous earth. That's another barrier method. It's basically crushed up sea creatures. They're very sharp, so try not to use them on a windy day. And when you do use them, this is where these masks really come into play. You might want to wear a mask. You definitely don't want to inhale that. Or go out at night with a flashlight and hand pick them. That's another option as well. But you got to be bold and brave. You got to kill them. Don't throw them in the street or throw them in your neighbor's yard. You got to go to town and get rid of them, because they take your plants, and then when you crush them, you see the plant that they just ate, coming out. So next, aphids, some milkweed here. They are born pregnant. So that's the bad news. The good news is their bodies are relatively fragile. So something like a hard hose will help kind of break them apart. Of course, prevention, anything that's going to attract things like lady beetles or lacewings, things that are going to eat aphids are going to be great. And then I like to make a non-toxic spray out of dish soap and water, a little bit of vegetable oil. That works really great too, and definitely non-toxic. Next. Weeds are technically pests, so at least I treat them accordingly. Hand pulling when the soil's moist is especially important. Pulling it before it goes to flower, goes to seed is also very important. Two of my most hated ones are featured here: Bermuda grass, which is in the top, oxalis, which if you're living in the Bay Area, you know that the hills are totally covered with it. Sheet mulching is a great option. I showed you an example of that earlier. To cover, to smother the weeds. Thing with these type of weeds, you're going to want to go a little bit thicker on the cardboard and a little bit thicker on the mulch. And then I always put my cardboard on dry. I don't water it to kind of anchor it. I keep it on dry. I need that weed blockage to last as long as possible, for sure. If you just have weeds and cracks, I do a mixture of 1 gallon of just white vinegar, that 5%, and 2 cups of Epsom soil. If you want to kind of jazz it up, I've been incorporating a splash of 20% of horticultural vinegar, and it works really great for weeds and cracks to try to basically keep the weed load down and not allow those weeds to kind of take over, or to set seed and then just kind of spread the love around the rest of your already existing landscape. Next. All right. I talked about this briefly. This does not need to be an expensive enterprise. Hopefully I've been able to point out some really great reuse options for you, and I'm happy to talk about any more if you have any questions. Make room for pollinators, and then try to experiment whenever possible. This year I'm doing Egyptian walking onions. I've never done them before. I'm kind of having a blast with them. I can't wait to see them continue to walk across my my planter beds, for sure. The picture here I have is lime tree from my backyard. It's the Rangpur lime. It's a mandarin and lime cross. So definitely a lot more juicier than your more traditional kind of green lime. Next, please. All right. So let's get to the questions. I keep seeing all these questions coming into the chat.
There's so many. Before we start with questions, I'd love to just put in the survey into the chat.
Right on.
So please take our survey. Thank you so much, Lori. Like, I always learn something new. I'm not a new gardener, but I'm like, oh, manzano peppers, and like, you're awesome. We're so fortunate to have you. But yes, everyone, please take the survey, because this informs us on future topics, and we're always looking for different ways to bring Lori back. So please take that survey. Now, yeah, let's get to the questions now. So there's
all right. I'm gonna I'm jumping from Cindy's. Yeah, the notes and links will be available. Oh, you need to know the soil content. Okay, so the one thing I did not include was what's known as the nitty-gritty. It is a great soil test that you can do at home, and it basically tells you what your soil type is and how much and in what proportion, and then how much organic material you have in the soil. So take an empty glass jar, take the label off. You're going to take a handful of your soil, or a couple of handfuls of your soil, fill it up about a third of the way, fill the rest up with water, and give it a shake, and then set it aside for probably and about a good day. Ooh. And then you have this. This is from my yard. This is a little bit old. Sandy particles are the ones that are going to settle first. They're the larger ones. They're generally going to be kind of gray, that sand, literally sand color. And then on top of that, you're going to have clay. If you happen to be in the situation where you live somewhere near a water source, silt is going to be another option for you. And that will settle. It'll be sand, silt, and then clay will sit on the top. And you'll be able to distinguish between the layers. Once it gives you a proportion, for me, of course, mine is primarily sand. So I know I'm going to have to water a little bit more often. I'm going to have to amend a little bit more often. And with clay, I know I'll have to add a little more organic material. And as you can see, this is relatively old, but there's not even really a lot of organic material on top, which means it desperately needs some. So the nitty gritty is just a great way to figure out what type of soil that you have. Because once you know what you're dealing with, it just makes it so much easier to garden. It really does. If you're having potting soil for container gardens, then that's completely different because those come with some drainage elements to them and stuff. All right, so let's get to some of these questions.
Do you want me to read any of them, or do you want to look through them?
Oh yeah, do you mind? That would be great.
Of course not. Of course not. Let's get to what are good flowers to have in your garden to attract pollinators.
Well, I definitely said yarrow. That's a really good one. If you have a sweet alyssum is good. And then any kind of member of like the daisy family, in that family, bees really do like that. If you think about the shape of flowers, anything that's kind of tube shaped, something a bee can get in or something a hummingbird can get in, any kind of thing that's kind of like a landing pad. Again, butterflies will like it, bees will like it. But yeah, any kind of plant. I mean, I'm gonna definitely go with something drought tolerant. California lilac is another great plant. Again, it's got all these multi kind of flowered kind of situations. And beneficial insects and bees do love that.
Yes, and alyssum, I just grew that and it reseeds readily in the garden too. At least it did.
Yeah, like I said, one packet of seeds and like sunflower seeds, you'll never need to buy them again, ever.
That's right. That's right. So and then we have another question on, is potting soil, or is it best to use potting soil or amend soil for raised beds?
I mean, definitely amended soil for raised beds. Potting soil, I mean, technically you could use potting soil. It has drainage elements in it. I think it really does come down to the cost. However, if you are doing raised beds and you're going to be incorporating a fair amount of like new soil on top of your parent soil, then the one thing I would recommend before you put down your raised bed is take a digging fork and try to aerate the soil. Go out on like maybe the day after it's rained where it's still kind of muddy but not sopping, and you're going to want to aerate it. You're going to want to open it up a little bit and then put the raised bed down on it, because what happens sometimes is the soil that's in the middle is so fluffy and viable and your roots have no problem traveling down there, but once they hit that hard pan, then the roots can't penetrate to go down vertically. They're going to start going laterally across because there's no way that they can penetrate. So if you can kind of open your soil up, I definitely wouldn't recommend things like a rototiller. That's going to open it up too much. And a rototiller is horrible for clay soil. Clay soil is compact enough as it is.
That's great. No, we have another presentation on our YouTube channel, The Benefits of No-Till Gardening. So if you guys go on the YouTube channel, there's definitely more resources, and then 3 more presentations from Lori. So then there's a great question about mulch. So Christy's wanting to mulch, but I already landscape in my yard, but she's concerned about wildfires. So is there a mulch that's more fire resistant? Any ideas?
There's not a mulch that's fire resistant. The one mulch that I would never use because it's more fire attractant is called gorilla hair. It kind of looks like it's like the shredded wheat of mulches. It's very fibrous. It basically looks like something you would use to start a fire, like tinder, because it's really fluffy. The idea with mulch is if you are currently irrigating things that are around the mulch, then the water is going to be held underneath the mulch layer into the soil. So even if something should happen to fall on it, the mulch itself is going to be damp enough to hopefully to cut that out and not be able to light up.
Yeah. And then there's a question about ants. Been fighting ants to keep them off climbing on fruit trees. I can see people put white stuff on the trunks, paint, but how can I fight them off? I think the paint on the trunks of trees is really more for protection for the tree more than ants. But anyway, I'll let you answer on ants.
Yeah, no, definitely. Usually if there's ants in conjunction with fruit trees, chances are there's aphids up in the trees and the ants are going back and forth. That becomes their freeway. So separating the ants from the aphids are going to be super important. Ants and aphids have this weird relationship where ants protect the aphids provide honeydew to feed the ants. So there's a product called Tanglefoot. It's like a sticky kind of waxy substance that you could put around the trunks of trees. Because it is kind of sticky, you may want to consider maybe putting like a piece of fabric or an ace bandage or something around the trunk and then putting the Tanglefoot on that. If you can separate the ants from the aphids, then the aphids are going to be pretty much on their own and then going to be more susceptible to predation by a lot of other beneficial insects. So Tanglefoot would be a good option.
I hear your cat.
Yes, I told you she was going to be in here.
This question from Bridget, she's purchased plants that are within her hardiness zone, but some of them have died. Is there another way to decide which plants to buy if it's not working? I mean, I think right now too, we're in global warming. So, maybe our hardiness zone, it might be more hot, and so maybe they're dying.
Yeah. So for me, I always on the cold end when I look at when it's good time, I like to plant after my last frost, which here in California really doesn't really count. It kind of does. So my last frost apparently was supposed to be at the end of February, I believe. And so I usually give it a couple of weeks, just for weird stuff. And then put plants out a couple weeks after my last hard frost. On the top end, so the plants just died because too much heat.
It just says that they end up dying. It doesn't look like it. She says why. She maybe doesn't know.
There's a lot of factors. I mean, sometimes moisture is a factor. Again, sometimes I'm sorry, Bridget. Oh, thank you, Bridget. Was it, what was the, okay. They start to grow and then they, sorry, I saw what it said.
Yeah, I don't know why. They just start to grow and then die.
There might be something in your soil. There is a fungus. It's called, I can't even pronounce it, Fusarium wilt. Generally, if you've already planted a really good healthy plant and you're doing everything else right as far as watering it and everything, that would be the only thing. It would probably have to be something in the soil. Using things like worm castings would be a great option to kind of keep that under control. Just add some of that to the soil, or like I do, I like to dilute it and then use it to water the soil. Usually I think it might just be a soil problem because everything being equal, that would be the only thing. Okay. Oh, you're welcome, Bridget.
So there's a question about, is snail bait bad?
I would say, well, it all really depends on the bait, to be honest. If I'm looking for a least toxic method of snail and slug control, I am probably going to use something like Sluggo. That's iron phosphate. And I would use that. That's probably the least toxic method. But you can use things like beer traps. That's technically bait as well. I also have a friend who likes to, she puts wooden boards around her planter boxes and raises them up slightly. Snails and slugs crawl underneath them in the morning to hide from us and to hide from the sun. And then she just walks on it and squishes them down into the ground and then lifts it back up again. So depending on what the toxicity would be, for sure. That's always my biggest concern because that toxicity ends up affecting things like plants and of course, soil, of course, as well, which we need to keep the soil nice and healthy. So I think it all depends on what that bait is. Does anybody have an example for me, or I don't use any toxic chemicals in my yard, so.
Sluggo's an organic brand. That's a bait, but it's organic. So
Yeah, Sluggo would probably be anything other than Sluggo, hand picking, or also when you incorporate mulch into your landscape, you get are you welcome, Elena? You get this beautiful black shiny beetle, probably about this big. It's the predaceous ground beetle, and its primary food is snails and slugs and their eggs. So just by adding mulch, which of course you should already do, you're kind of bringing in a whole other host of things, which is really important.
And Elena's second question, she's asking about putting seeds directly into a container. So I'm maybe if you, Elena, can you put another question in there to clarify that? Can you?
Are you talking about direct sowing? So if you don't want to start plants by transplanting, you can do that. It just has to be you could do that with tomatoes, you could do that with squashes or cucumbers. It's just going to take them, you could definitely do that. It just, usually the soil has to be at least 65, 70 degrees in order to germinate seeds for like peppers and stuff like that. Cooler ones for cooler crops, of course. But yeah, you could definitely do that. You just have to imagine that your season's going to be a little bit shorter because when the main growing's done in the transplant, when it's cold outside, you don't have to take that in consideration. So it's going to be another 8 to 10 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks from the time you plant the seeds, if the soil is warm enough, from the time you can have a plant that's going to be big enough to start producing fruit, or grow and then grow to be big enough to start producing fruit. But yeah, it's totally possible. Absolutely. And if you grow all year round, then definitely. I still have a tomato plant from last year.
And there's a few questions on planting seeds. So this, so Angelica had planned to plant seeds this weekend after soaking tonight with the rain that lasts a few days here in the Bay Area. Should I wait to plant until the soil is drier, or just put them out now?
You can put them out now. I wouldn't wait for the soil to dry. Yeah, I would put them out now.
Yeah, there's another question on how often to water when starting from seed.
If I'm going to be planting in order to transplant, I really just want to make sure that my seedlings stay moist and not too waterlogged. So that's why I use a spray bottle, and I'll either spray directly on the soil, or if I'm using things like egg cartons, I'll just spray directly on the paper, the toilet paper roll or the egg cartons. I'll do that. So it's really kind of making sure that it has enough moisture, for sure. If you're planting outside, then it's the same. You definitely want to make sure that there's still a fair amount of moisture in there. And I mean, there's always the opportunity to, if you're planting in containers, and you want to direct seed, you also have the option of maybe covering the container with something that kind of trap the heat, or to increase the temperature of the soil. That's also another option.
Okay, there's a question from Cindy. I've planted new aloes in full sun because they're supposed to be more heat tolerant than the tender succulents. Do I have to cover aloes during the blazing hot summer days?
You do not. The only time I would probably cover aloes is if you're expecting a frost, because succulents are mostly water. So I would definitely consider if there's a frost to come in anywhere near you, I would probably cover it. Something fabric as opposed to something plastic. Plastic traps the moisture underneath, and then sometimes crystallizes it, which you're trying to avoid. But a blanket, or you can buy different types of stuff, or bring it inside if it's in a container. Yeah, you could definitely do that. But yeah, succulents are pretty tough. They're pretty tough, fortunately.
Yeah, and Cindy also wanted you to comment on watering succulents in our Zone 9B summers.
That's my zone. So if I'm incorporating succulents as part of my garden, I'm going to say this is my tomato, and say my tomato plant is a little bit higher, I'm probably going to plant a succulent probably about 3 or 4 or 5 feet away from it, because it's going to take advantage. When I water my tomato plant, it's going to take advantage of whatever the water it can grab from the tomato. I don't want to plant them too close together, because if I water for my tomato, I'm going to kill my succulent. So I usually try to grow things in conjunction with other things, and then I don't have to worry about irrigating succulents, and I don't have to worry about overwatering my succulents. That's usually my biggest concern, is overwatering them. So yeah, you can interplant them if you have drought tolerant plants. Incorporating succulents in that is also a really great idea.
This is the last question I think we're gonna have time for, is what type of collards do you show in the bucket?
I'm sorry, what?
What type of collards did you show in the bucket? The tree collards. Oops.
Oh, they were just tree collards. I'm not familiar with too many other varieties. But yeah, it's just the perennial tree collard. They used to be used for feeding cattle in England.
Yes, they're super.
They grew them strictly to feed cows.
Yeah, they're the one thing.
Super.
Yeah, when raised beds go unwatered and they have the tree collards still survive. I've never killed a tree collard, so you know,
Nope.
it's a good plant to start off with.
Yeah. If you want a tree collard, you can propagating them by seed usually isn't an option. And it usually takes a little bit. The best way to propagate tree collards is by cuttings. So find someone who has a tree collard and cut, 4 or 5 inch lengths. And then the nice thing about it is I could take my little pieces and take them home and just plop them right into the soil, water it, and then walk away. They will root instantly and start to grow. And then as your plants get older and start to get woody, you can start taking cuttings on and then kind of do a generational thing as the tree collards go from year 4 to year 5 and get a little bit woody. Then you have new backups.